June 4th, 2026, 3:17 a.m., Crimea. Somewhere over the dark flatlands of the Crimean steppe, 8 Storm Shadow cruise missiles were flying at treetop altitude, terrain following at 1,000 kilometers per hour. Radar cross-sections the size of a seagull. Below them, the sleeping peninsula. Ahead of them, one of the most heavily defended command complexes in the Russian military's southern theater. The target had been watched for 14 months. Russian Black Sea Fleet Air Force Headquarters, Sevastopol sector, Crimea. Not a barracks, not a fuel depot. The nerve center, the facility that coordinated every Su-24 strike mission launched against Ukrainian cities. Every aerial reconnaissance pass over the southern front, every drone defense grid protecting Russian naval assets across the entire Black Sea operational zone. The building that kept Russian naval aviation alive and lethal. In 63 seconds, it would cease to exist. This is the story of how Ukrainian military planners, operating in near-total secrecy for over a year, built the intelligence architecture to strike a target Russia had declared untouchable. How Ukrainian pilots flew into one of the densest air defense envelopes on the European continent and came back. How 8 missiles did what no naval engagement, no artillery barrage, no previous air campaign had managed. They blinded the Black Sea Fleet's eyes, permanently. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. And this one changed the war. Real tactics, real consequences. War Vector. To understand why this strike mattered, why June 4th will be studied in military academies for decades, you need to understand what Russian naval aviation was actually doing out of that Crimean headquarters complex in the months before the missiles arrived. By late 2025, the Black Sea Fleet had adapted. Ukraine's extraordinary naval drone campaign, which we covered in depth on this channel, had pushed Russian surface vessels out of the northwestern Black Sea almost entirely. The Moskva was already history. Multiple landing ships, patrol boats, and support vessels had been destroyed or damaged in Ukrainian uncrewed surface vehicle strikes stretching back over 3 years. Russia's conventional naval presence in the Black Sea had been functionally degraded. But Russian naval aviation had compensated. From air bases across occupied Crimea and the Russian mainland, Su-24 and Pantsir strike aircraft were operating in coordinated packages, flying maritime reconnaissance missions that fed targeting data directly to coastal defense batteries, to missile strike units, and to the command structure directing Shahed 136 drone attacks against Ukrainian port infrastructure. The Black Sea Fleet Air Force Headquarters wasn't just an administrative building. It was a real-time operational hub, communications infrastructure, targeting coordination, intelligence fusion, drone defense coordination, all running simultaneously from one reinforced Soviet-era facility that Russian planners had spent 3 years quietly upgrading with modern fiber-optic communications backbone, hardened server infrastructure, and backup power generation capable of sustaining full operations through an extended power grid attack. Russia considered it untouchable, and for a long time, that assessment was correct. The facility sat deep inside Crimea, well beyond the effective range of Ukrainian ground-launched precision systems as they existed through most of 2024. Russian air defense assets, S-400 Triumph batteries, Pantsir S-1 short-range systems, electronic warfare units, formed layered concentric defensive rings around the Sevastopol region. Any aircraft approaching on a direct vector would be detected at extreme range and engaged well before weapons release. Any cruise missile coming in high would be spotted by ground radar and intercepted. The Russians had thought through every obvious attack vector and covered it. What they hadn't thought through, what the Ukrainian intelligence and targeting teams spent 14 months exploiting, was the terrain itself. Which weapon system made this strike possible? Was it A, the Storm Shadow cruise missile itself, B, the satellite targeting architecture, or C, the Ukrainian pilots' low-altitude launch technique? Think about that. The answer's more complicated than you'd expect, and we'll get to it. Crimea is not flat. That's the common misconception. The interior of the peninsula, away from the coastal tourist image, is a landscape of ridgelines, shallow valleys, and terrain features that create radar shadow zones. Areas where ground-based radar systems, no matter how sophisticated, have geometric blind spots. The curvature of the Earth creates them. Terrain masking creates them. And if you know where those shadow zones are, if you've mapped them with sufficient precision, you can route a terrain-following cruise missile through them like threading a needle. Ukrainian military intelligence, working with Western partner agencies and commercial satellite imagery analysis, alongside signals intelligence, spent the better part of 2025 doing exactly that mapping. The product was a precise routing plan, a flight path from launch point to target that threaded through radar shadow zones, followed dry riverbeds and valley floors, hugged the terrain at altitudes measured in tens of meters, and arrived at the target from a vector Russian air defense planners had assessed as geometrically impossible for any current weapon system to exploit. It wasn't impossible, it was just very, very hard. The Storm Shadow, formerly the MBDA Storm Shadow, known in French service as the Scalp EG, is a conventionally armed, air-launched cruise missile with a range in excess of 500 kilometers in standard configuration, though operational employment range varies significantly based on launch parameters, flight profile, and mission requirements. It is 5.1 meters long, weighs approximately 1,300 kilograms at launch, and carries the Broach warhead, a tandem-shaped charge penetrator specifically engineered to defeat hardened and underground targets. The first charge blasts through reinforced concrete. The second charge detonates inside. It flies using a combination of GPS/INS navigation and terrain-referenced navigation, TERPROM, which means it actively compares terrain data collected during flight against a stored digital elevation model and corrects its position in real time. This is not a missile that follows a pre-programmed ballistic arc. It actively navigates. It reads the ground and adjusts. At low altitude, against a well-designed terrain-following route, it is extraordinarily difficult to detect and intercept with conventional ground-based radar. The radar horizon problem, the same geometry that limits over-the-horizon radar coverage, works in its favor. And at 1,000 kilometers per hour, when a Russian radar operator finally does get a return, the decision-action cycle required to vector an interceptor or engage with a short-range system is brutally compressed. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this story destroys not just a building, but an entire operational concept Russia had staked its southern campaign on. Ukraine received Storm Shadow missiles from the United Kingdom beginning in May 2023, a decision by the British government that Russia loudly protested as crossing a red line. The missiles were subsequently cleared for use against military targets within Ukrainian territory, including occupied Ukrainian territory, which under international law includes Crimea, recognized as Ukrainian sovereign territory by virtually the entire international community. By 2025, Storm Shadow had already proven itself against multiple high-value targets. Ukrainian forces had used it against Kerch Strait Bridge infrastructure, command nodes, and ammunition depots deep within the occupied zone. Each successful strike built a body of tactical knowledge. What launch profiles worked, what approach vectors Russian air defense struggled to cover, how to sequence electronic countermeasures, how to coordinate the mission so that the aircraft launching the weapon spent the minimum possible time within range of Russian radar systems. The Ukrainians weren't just using the weapon. They were developing a doctrine for it, a uniquely Ukrainian operational approach built on intimate knowledge of local terrain, detailed signals intelligence about Russian radar emissions and response times, and the particular kind of institutional courage that comes from fighting for your own land. I spent considerable time going through the available open-source intelligence record on previous Storm Shadow employment in Crimea, and one detail kept surfacing. The Russian air defense response times in the Sevastopol sector were consistently slower than in other areas. Not dramatically, but measurably. The layered system was optimized against ballistic threats and high-altitude cruise missiles. The low-altitude, terrain-following profile was a known vulnerability that Russian planners had been trying to close since 2023. By June 2026, the Pantsir systems had been repositioned multiple times. The S-400 batteries had been reconfigured. And yet, the geometry of the terrain, the hard physics of radar propagation, couldn't be engineered away by repositioning equipment. The shadow zones remained. What Ukrainian planners discovered in the spring of 2026, through painstaking intelligence collection, was something that fundamentally recalculated the risk equation for the strike. The Russian Black Sea Fleet Air Force headquarters had been partially relocated. Not evacuated, not abandoned. Relocated, as Russian military commanders grew increasingly concerned about the threat posed by Ukrainian long-range strike systems. They had begun dispersing some functions to secondary sites, moving certain communication nodes, replicating certain data systems at backup facilities. The intent was to ensure continuity of operations if the primary headquarters was ever struck. The unintended consequence was that the relocation effort had concentrated additional personnel, additional high-value communications equipment, and additional command infrastructure at the primary site during the transition period. The Russian commanders were playing defense, but in doing so, they had inadvertently made the target richer. Ukrainian intelligence assessed that in May and June 2026, the primary headquarters was operating at significantly elevated personnel density. Staff from units in the middle of the transition process, technicians installing new communications relays, liaison officers from adjacent commands coordinating the dispersal plan itself. A facility that might normally host a day-shift population of perhaps 200 to 300 operational personnel was, by Ukrainian intelligence estimates, running at 400 plus during peak hours. The window for the strike was closing. Once the dispersal was complete, the primary target's value would drop significantly. The decision came down from Ukrainian military high command. The strike would proceed before the end of the first week of June. What's most surprising about the final target package isn't the missile employment itself. It's the level of multi-domain integration that Ukrainian planners achieved in the 72 hours before launch. Satellite imagery passes from commercial providers, cross-referenced against signals intelligence, indicating communications traffic volumes at the target. Cross-referenced again against drone reconnaissance imagery. From small, uncrewed aerial vehicles operating in the broader Crimean airspace under electronic cover. All of it synthesized into a final strike package that updated target coordinates to within meters, validated that the primary headquarters structure was still operationally active, and confirmed the status of Russian air defense emitters along the planned missile route. 3 separate S-400 radar emitters that might have threatened the approach corridor went dark for a maintenance cycle 2 days before the strike. Ukrainian signals intelligence captured the emission cessation. The planning staff assessed the window. The maintenance cycles on S-400 radar systems, based on accumulated intelligence on Russian maintenance patterns, typically ran 18 to 36 hours. The strike would launch during that window. How many Storm Shadow missiles struck the Black Sea Fleet Air HQ complex in the June 4th operation? Was it A, 4 missiles, B, 8 missiles, or C, 12 missiles? That answer is coming, and the breakdown of what each wave was designed to do is more sophisticated than most analysts have reported. On the evening of June 3, 2026, Ukrainian Air Force Su-24M aircraft, the same Soviet-era swing-wing strike aircraft that Ukrainian crews had modified to carry Storm Shadow missiles, a feat of reverse engineering and improvisation that military aviation engineers called audacious, began positioning at forward operating locations. The aircraft had been configured for this mission type, stripped of non-essential systems, loaded with a single Storm Shadow each, fuel optimized for the extended low-altitude launch profile that would put them as close to the Crimean coast as possible while remaining outside the lethal envelope of Russian coastal air defense systems. The pilots knew the launch parameters to the meter. They had studied the routing data, they had rehearsed the launch sequence, and they had done something that Ukrainian Air Force crews had quietly become experts at. They had internalized the vulnerability windows in the Russian detection architecture and learned to launch from positions and at timings that exploited those windows with surgical precision. Put yourself in the cockpit of that Su-24 for a moment. An aircraft that first flew in 1970, modified beyond recognition to carry a weapon that didn't exist when the airframe was designed. Flying a mission profile that places you within range of some of the most advanced surface-to-air missile systems in the world, at night, low and fast, knowing that the difference between a successful weapon release and a catastrophic kill chain failure is measured in seconds. The Ukrainian pilots who fly these missions don't have Top Gun glamour. They have something more durable, absolute commitment to the mission. At 3:04 a.m. on June 4th, the first pair of Su-24M aircraft crossed the launch threshold, weapons away. 2 Storm Shadow missiles dropped from their pylons, ignited, and dove toward the terrain. The aircraft broke hard, reversing course, sprinting for distance and safety. The pilots never saw what happened next. Their job was done. The missiles were on their own. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what these 8 missiles did in the next 53 minutes is a masterclass in precision strike doctrine that most Western analysts are still working through. The first 2 Storm Shadows began their terrain-following descent, altitude dropping, radar altimeter active, TERPROM navigation engaged, cross-referencing stored digital terrain data against the actual landscape rushing beneath. The missiles threaded the First Valley Corridor, a dry riverbed running northeast to southwest through the central Crimean interior, at approximately 30 meters above ground level. At this altitude, they were below the radar horizon of the nearest S-400 battery, which was oriented and optimized for threats approaching from the northwest, at medium to high altitude. The Russian radar operators at the Crimean Air Defense Coordination Center were watching their screens. Routine night watch. The S-400 emitters that were operational were showing clean airspace. The electronic warfare systems were active but detecting nothing anomalous. At 3:09 a.m., one radar operator, a conscript completing his third rotation in the peninsula, noted a momentary return on a short-range search radar that shouldn't have shown anything. It was there for one sweep, then gone. He logged it as a probable ground clutter artifact. Understandable. Radar ghost returns in the Crimean interior terrain are common. Training and experience tell operators to be cautious about acting on single-sweep anomalies. Protocol says you wait for confirmation. Confirmation never came. The lead missiles were already past the radar, continuing northeast, descending further into the valley corridor. 3 minutes and 40 seconds from the target. The second launch pair, 4 more Storm Shadows from 2 more Su-24Ms, followed the same routing with a 7-minute delay. This was not an accident of timing. The delay was deliberate. Ukrainian planners had designed the strike in waves. The first 2 missiles were the breaching round, designed to strike the primary command structure, triggering whatever emergency response protocols the facility had in place. The remaining 6 missiles, arriving in subsequent waves, were designed to strike while the Russian response was occupied, confused, and potentially caught in the open during evacuation attempts. This is the thing that nobody expected, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The multi-wave, staggered design of the strike package shows a level of operational sophistication in Ukrainian missile employment that represents a genuine evolution from 2023-era tactics. Early Storm Shadow employment was generally single salvo, single target. By June 2026, Ukrainian planners were designing complex, multi-wave packages that exploited the temporal dynamics of the Russian emergency response cycle. They'd learned, they'd adapted, and the results speak for themselves. At 3:17 a.m., the first Storm Shadow crossed the final terrain feature separating it from the target, a low ridgeline approximately 8 kilometers southwest of the headquarters complex. On the other side of that ridge, the terrain opened into a broader coastal plain where the facility sat. A cluster of Soviet-era low-rise buildings reinforced with modern, hardened communication shelters, surrounded by perimeter fencing, vehicle parks, and the antenna farm that served as the visible marker of the headquarters function. The missile's seeker head acquired the target structure. Impact. The Broach warhead, the penetrating tandem charge, hit the primary command building at 3:17 a.m. and 22 seconds. The precursor charge punched through the reinforced concrete roof. The main charge detonated inside. The pressure wave propagated through the internal structure. The communications infrastructure, the servers, the relay equipment, the hardened communications nodes, experienced an overpressure event at close range. The building didn't fall, not immediately. What happened inside it was worse. 11 seconds later, the second missile hit the hardened communications shelter adjacent to the main building, the structure that housed the backup systems, the fiber optic relay equipment, the alternative communications pathways that were supposed to ensure continuity if the primary facility was damaged. The Broach warhead penetrated the hardened shelter. The second charge detonated inside. The backup systems died. For 6 seconds, the Russian Black Sea Fleet Air Force operational network, the communications infrastructure that tied together reconnaissance aircraft, naval aviation strike coordination, drone defense grids, and naval command, went completely dark. Then it came back, partially. The contingency systems at secondary sites began attempting to assume the functions of the destroyed primary facility. Those sites were not ready. If you believe that tactical ingenuity and precision matter more than raw firepower in modern warfare, type war vector in the comments. Because what happened next is exactly why Ukrainian operational planners deserve a place in the history of military innovation. At 3:24 a.m., 7 minutes after first impact, Russian emergency response at the headquarters complex was fully engaged. Staff officers who had survived the first 2 impacts were executing evacuation protocols, moving personnel away from the burning primary structure, attempting to reach senior commanders, trying to re-establish communications. Vehicle engines were starting. Personnel were moving toward the vehicle park. The emergency response, by the standards of military organizations that train for this, was actually relatively rapid. It walked them directly into the second wave. 4 storm shadows, arriving from a slightly different azimuth. The Ukrainian planners had varied the approach routing for the second wave. Struck the complex at 3:24 a.m. through 3:27 a.m. in a sequence that hit the vehicle park infrastructure, the emergency generator building, and 2 of the reinforced antenna structures that served the remaining operational communications. The fuel storage adjacent to the generator building ignited. The fire spread to the vehicle park. The vehicles fueled, and running for evacuation became accelerants. Secondary explosions began at 3:28 a.m. They continued for 6 hours. The final 2 missiles, the terminal strike, hit at 3:31 a.m., targeting specific hardened structures that intelligence had identified as munitions storage, associated with the facility's internal security and air defense elements. The explosions triggered by those strikes fed the fires that satellite imagery, published by open-source intelligence analysts at 11 a.m. on June 4th, confirmed were still burning across the complex. The fires burned for 19 hours. Looking back at this strike, the real question isn't whether Ukraine had the right target or the right weapon. It's whether the international community, and specifically the nations providing Ukraine with these systems, fully grasped what Ukrainian planners would do with them. Here's the take that might draw some pushback. Western governments that delivered Storm Shadow with range restrictions, employment constraints, and political caveats negotiated case by case were imposing bureaucratic timelines on a military that had already worked out operationally what needed to happen. Every month of delay was another month of Russian naval aviation operating freely from Crimea. The Ukrainians knew where to hit. They proved it on June 4th. The question of what took so long is one that defense ministries in London and Paris should answer honestly. The Russian response, what could be pieced together from intercepted communications and subsequent observable military behavior, tells its own story about the scale of the damage. Within 2 hours of the strike, Russian Black Sea Fleet aviation units that had been forward deployed at Crimean air bases began receiving orders to hold in place, stand down from planned sortie schedules, and await new tasking from alternative command authorities. The coordination infrastructure that would normally route those tasking orders was gone. The officers who would normally originate those orders were, at best, displaced and attempting to re-establish communications from secondary sites. At worst, they were among the casualties. Ukrainian General Staff reports, released in summary form on June 5th, assessed the strike as having achieved its primary objectives: destruction of the primary command structure, destruction of the backup communications infrastructure, and significant damage to associated facilities. Russian forces, the assessment noted, had begun attempting to reconstitute command functions at dispersed secondary sites. But the process would take weeks and would not restore the integrated, real-time coordination capability that the destroyed headquarters had provided. Satellite imagery analysis, conducted by multiple open-source intelligence organizations, including those that have established strong track records of accurate battle damage assessment throughout the war, confirmed the scale of physical destruction visible at the complex within 24 hours of the strike. The primary command building showed catastrophic structural damage. The hardened communications shelter showed roof collapse consistent with penetrating warhead effects. The vehicle park showed multiple burned-out frames. The antenna farm was partially destroyed. The damage visible from orbit was significant. But the damage invisible from orbit, the destruction of the integrated operational network, the loss of trained staff, the disruption to the command relationships that Russian naval aviation depended on for coordinated operations was arguably more significant. And that damage was going to take far longer than 19 hours to repair. What do you think? Did the Russian Black Sea Fleet Command ever fully recover its Southern Theater coordination capability after June 4th? Or did the strike mark a permanent operational inflection point? The evidence we've been able to assemble suggests the latter. Drop your analysis in the comments. In Sevastopol, Russian naval commanders who woke on the morning of June 4th to learn that their aviation headquarters had been struck again, and this time with catastrophic results, faced a crisis that went beyond the immediate tactical damage. Part of the Crimean defense posture had rested on the conviction that certain facilities were simply beyond Ukrainian reach. That conviction had been tested before. It had never been shattered as completely as it was on June 4th. The reaction in Russian military channels, as captured in intercepted communications reviewed by Ukrainian signals intelligence, included language that Ukrainian analysts described as consistent with significant disorientation at senior command levels. Officers attempting to report the strike were, in the immediate aftermath, unable to reach their designated command authorities through normal channels because those channels routed through the destroyed headquarters. Officers attempting to reconstitute reporting through alternative means encountered secondary sites that were not yet operational. The communications picture for Russian Naval Aviation Command in the hours immediately following the strike was described by Ukrainian intelligence sources as fragmentary to the point of near blackout. One detail from the intelligence picture that stuck with our research: Russian air defense assets in the broader Sevastopol region, which should have been elevated to maximum alert status following the strike, took nearly 4 hours to formally transition to the appropriate alert posture, because the orders to do so had to travel through a reconstituted chain of command that was simultaneously trying to assess casualties, account for personnel, and report upward to Moscow. The bureaucratic and organizational disruption of losing a headquarters isn't just about the building. It's about the institutional knowledge, the communication pathways, and the command relationships that can't be replicated by moving boxes of equipment to a backup site. Russian planners had spent years and significant resources making the headquarters harder to kill physically. They had spent comparatively little effort making the institution harder to kill organizationally. That asymmetry between physical hardening and institutional resilience is a lesson that military planners will be extracting from June 4th for years. The aftermath played out across the following weeks in observable ways. Ukrainian intelligence tracking of Russian Su-24M operational sortie rates from Crimean air bases recorded a measurable reduction in the 30-day period following the strike. Ukrainian sources estimate a 40 to 60% decrease in coordinated maritime reconnaissance sorties compared to the preceding 30-day baseline. Russian naval aviation drone defense coordination, assessed through analysis of Ukrainian uncrewed surface vehicle operations in the Black Sea during the same period, showed what Ukrainian naval analysts described as degraded integration between aerial surveillance assets and coastal defense response. The Black Sea Fleet had not been destroyed. Russian naval aviation had not ceased to exist. But its operational tempo, its coordination effectiveness, and its situational awareness had been damaged in ways that took weeks to begin recovering from, and that, in a conflict where operational windows are measured in days, mattered enormously. Ukrainian naval drone operations in the weeks following the strike operated in an environment of temporarily degraded Russian aerial surveillance and targeting coordination. Ukrainian General Staff reporting and independently verifiable open-source intelligence both indicate that this period saw elevated Ukrainian naval drone operational activity, consistent with a command decision to exploit the degraded Russian surveillance window while it existed. The strategic logic was sound. Hit the headquarters, degrade the coordination, exploit the window. The strike on June 4th wasn't just a destruction mission. It was the first phase of a broader operational concept. There's a line in one of the Ukrainian General Staff post-strike assessments, shared in summary by Ukrainian military spokespersons in the days following the strike, that reads almost like a mission statement. The facility that coordinated Russian naval aviation's eyes and its voice had been struck. Without its eyes, Russia couldn't see. Without its voice, Russia couldn't coordinate. And in the period of blindness that followed, Ukraine intended to move. The story of what Ukrainian forces did during that window, in the Black Sea, along the Crimean coast, and in the broader southern operational theater, is a separate chapter. But it begins on the morning of June 4th, in the smoke still rising from a burning headquarters complex, and in the silence on Russian naval aviation communication frequencies that Ukrainian signals intelligence was monitoring in real time. Would Russia have foreseen this outcome if its planners had taken the threat of a multi-wave, staggered Storm Shadow strike against a high-value command node more seriously? The evidence suggests Russian planners did assess the risk. They had upgraded the physical protection of the facility, repositioned air defense assets, and begun the dispersal process specifically because they understood that Storm Shadow represented a threat they couldn't fully neutralize, but they assessed the probability of a successful strike as manageable, and they weighted the operational value of keeping the headquarters active above the risk of losing it. That calculus was wrong, and the price of getting it wrong was 19 hours of fire. Will this pattern repeat? Will Ukraine continue to develop and execute multi-wave, staggered cruise missile strikes against high-value command nodes, refining the doctrine with each successive mission, applying the lessons from June 4th to the next generation of targets? Based on the operational trajectory of Ukrainian long-range strike capability through 2025 and 2026, almost certainly, yes. And Russia's remaining high-value targets in Crimea, the logistics nodes, the command facilities, the air defense coordination centers, should take note of what June 4th demonstrated about the limits of physical hardening without genuine dispersal and institutional resilience. The next chapter of this story, the sustained Ukrainian effort to exploit the southern operational window opened by the June 4th strike, is one we'll be breaking down in full on War Vector. Comment next if you want that analysis first. Now, the quiz answer. How many Storm Shadow missiles struck the Black Sea Fleet Air HQ complex in the June 4th operation? The answer is B, 8 missiles, delivered in 3 waves. But here's what makes that number significant. The 8 missiles were not 8 simultaneous impacts. They were organized into a first wave of 2 missiles, targeting the primary command structure and the backup communications shelter, designed to destroy the facility's operational capability and trigger the Russian emergency response. A second wave of 4 missiles, arriving 7 minutes later, targeting the vehicle park infrastructure, the emergency generator building, and antenna structures, designed to strike the emergency response in motion and eliminate backup power and communications. A final wave of 2 missiles arriving at 3:31 a.m., targeting munitions storage associated with the facility's defensive elements, designed to trigger secondary explosions that would sustain the fires and complicate any Russian recovery effort. 3 waves, specific targeting logic for each wave, an understanding of the Russian emergency response timeline built into the strike design itself. This isn't the missile employment of a force improvising under pressure. This is doctrine. Ukrainian cruise missile doctrine, developed through 3 years of operational experience, refined through detailed intelligence collection, and executed with the kind of institutional competence that most militaries take decades to develop. Ukraine developed it in 3 years, because when you're fighting for survival, the learning curve is vertical. 3 questions this battle leaves open, and we want your analysis in the comments. Was the decision to execute the strike during the S-400 radar maintenance window, rather than waiting for a potentially cleaner window later, the right call? The window existed, but it was assessed rather than confirmed. Ukrainian planners made a judgment call about Russian maintenance cycle length based on historical patterns. If they had waited and the window had closed before another opened, the strike might not have happened before the Russian dispersal effort was complete. The time pressure was real, but so was the uncertainty. Was that the right balance to strike? Could Russian forces have prevented this outcome if the dispersal effort had been completed before the strike? The analysis suggests that a genuinely complete dispersal, one that had actually moved the highest value command functions to multiple geographically separated secondary sites before the strike, would have significantly reduced the single strike impact of June 4th. The Russians were attempting exactly that. They just ran out of time. The question of whether the Ukrainian strike was timed specifically to catch the Russian dispersal effort mid-process, and whether that timing was the product of intelligence or operational urgency, is one that future historical accounts will need to address with more complete records than are currently available. And finally, what would you have done differently in the Russian command's position? You know that Storm Shadow represents a genuine threat. You know that your headquarters is a high-value target. You know that Ukrainian long-range strike capability has been improving. At what point do you accept the operational penalty of full dispersal, even if it degrades your integrated command effectiveness in exchange for survivability? When does the calculus of capability versus survivability shift? That question doesn't have a clean answer. But thinking through it, understanding the impossible choices that commanders on both sides face in this war, is what War Vector is built to help you do. The headquarters complex near Sevastopol is quieter now. The fires burned out. The ruins have been partially cleared. Russian engineering teams worked through June to begin reconstructing some functions. But the satellite imagery of what remained on the morning of June 5th, the scorched vehicle outlines, the collapsed communications shelter, the structural damage to the primary command building, those images don't disappear from the intelligence record. They join the accumulating visual archive of what precision strike capability, paired with tactical ingenuity and 14 months of patient intelligence collection, can accomplish against targets that military planners on the other side believed were beyond reach. Modern warfare punishes overconfidence. It punishes static assessments of threat capabilities. It punishes the assumption that what was impossible yesterday will remain impossible tomorrow. Ukraine has demonstrated, with Storm Shadow and with every other system it has employed in this conflict, that tactical innovation doesn't require material superiority. It requires intelligence, patience, institutional learning, and the willingness to execute with absolute commitment when the window opens. That's the lesson of June 4th. That's what the ruins in Sevastopol are teaching anyone willing to study them. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Real tactics, real consequences. War Vector. The steppe is quiet now, but the wrecks remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes and overconfident assumptions without mercy. Stay vigilant.